The Tongass National Forest was like any other place in the country. Sprawling across millions of acres, it was a labyrinth of towering trees, mist-choked valleys, and an unrelenting wilderness that could swallow a man whole. As a DNR officer, it was my job to protect both the forest and the people who ventured into it. That meant everything from enforcing hunting regulations to tracking lost hikers. Most of the time, missing persons reports were simple. Someone got turned around, lost their bearings, or decided to extend their trip without telling anyone. Most of the time. The call came early in the morning. My boss told me a woman named Sarah Watkins was looking for her husband Bill. He had been on a solo hunting trip deep in the forest and was supposed to catch a flight home 2 days ago. At first, Sarah just assumed he missed it. Bill wasn't great with his phone, and he loved his time alone in the woods. But 2 days with no word, that wasn't like him, especially not when he had 2 young kids at home. I was given the last location Bill had checked in from, a remote section of the forest far from marked trails. It wasn't a place you stumbled upon. You had to want to be there. I drove my Jeep as far as I could until the road disappeared into thick brush. The rest of the trip would be on foot. The hike itself wasn't difficult, but something about it unsettled me. The air felt heavy, and the usual sounds of forest, birds, distant rustling in the undergrowth were eerily absent. After about an hour, I found Bill's campsite. It was still intact. That alone was strange. If Bill had wandered off and gotten lost, why was everything still here? His gear, his pack, even his rifle. No experienced hunter would leave his gun behind unless he planned to return soon. The fire pit had been recently used, maybe the night before, but there were no signs of distress, no tracks leading away from the camp. I called out for Bill. Nothing. The tent was zipped shut, so I knelt down and unzipped it. Inside, everything was neatly in place, no sign of a struggle. That's when I noticed a small book on the camping table, a journal. I normally wouldn't invade someone's privacy, but in a search and rescue situation, anything could be a clue. I picked up the journal and started reading. Day 1, Bill wrote about setting up camp and taking in the beauty of the forest. He missed his wife and kids, but was excited for some solitude. Day 2, Bill scouted the area, checked his supplies, and then something strange. He wrote about seeing a creature. He wasn't sure what it was, but it stood on 2 legs, was impossibly large, and had pitch black skin. It had been too far away for him to make out any details, but he had the unsettling feeling that it was watching him. Day 3, Bill barely slept. He heard something moving around his campsite, but every time he checked, nothing was there. He started to think the thing he had seen in the woods was coming closer. He debated leaving, but decided to stay one more night. Day 4, Bill wrote something that made my stomach turn. He saw himself, an exact duplicate of himself moving around the campsite. It mimicked his posture, his habits, everything. He knew it wasn't possible, but it was still there, watching him. He wrote that he was packing up immediately. Day 5. The final entry was short. It simply said, "It isn't me. Don't believe a word it says. Ask it where my wife and I first met. If it doesn't say Green Tree Park, then it's not me." I set the journal down, my pulse quickening. Bill must have been hallucinating. Isolation can do that to people, but something about the way it was written felt lucid, rational. I stepped out of the tent, my mind racing with questions. Then I froze. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, standing completely still, staring at me. I took a cautious step forward, asking who he was. He said his name was Bill. Relief should have flooded me, but it didn't. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. His face, while identical to the photo I'd seen of Bill, was expressionless, his eyes too still. Something about him felt wrong. I told him his wife was worried and had sent me to check on him. He said he knew. He didn't move. I told him his kids missed him and that he should at least call to let them know he was okay. He said he would, but he still didn't move. The silence stretched between us, thick and unnatural. He just stood there, staring. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. If Bill was fine, I couldn't force him to leave. Maybe he had just been out of contact for too long and was just adjusting to conversation again. But as I turned to leave, something gnawed at the back of my mind. The journal. I turned back to Bill and mentioned that he was lucky to have a wife who cared so much. He nodded, expression unchanged. Then I asked him where he and his wife had met. He hesitated, but then he said, "At school." I don't know how I was able to keep a straight face, but I did. I felt fear flood my body. I forced myself to nod as if that answer made sense. Then I turned and walked away. The moment I was out of his sight, I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, branches whipping against my arms and legs as I tore through the trees. I didn't stop until I reached my Jeep, jumped in, and floored it back to the station. I told my boss that I hadn't found Bill and that we needed to organize a search team. By the time we returned to the campsite, everything was gone. The tent, the fire pit, the journal vanished. It was as if no one had ever been there. No sign of Bill, no tracks leading away. We searched for days, but never found him. I don't know what happened to Bill Watkins. I don't know if he got lost, or if he lost his mind in isolation, or if something in that forest took him. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the last thing he wrote in that journal. It isn't me. And I wonder if, somewhere out in those endless woods, something is still walking around, wearing Bill Watkins' face. For years, my friend and I had hunted together. We'd taken trips all across the country, always chasing the best spots, but this year we decided on something different: West Virginia. We heard rumors of monster bucks hidden deep in the Appalachian forest, untouched by modern hunters. It sounded like the perfect challenge. We packed up our gear, loaded the truck, and made the drive into the mountains. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense trees. After hiking a few miles in, we found a solid clearing to set up camp. The night was spent around the fire, strategizing our plan for the morning. The air was cool, the stars endless, and the excitement was thick between us. At first light, we geared up and set out. The morning couldn't have been better: crisp air, perfect silence, and wildlife everywhere. It felt like one of those rare hunts where everything aligned. We made our way through the thick brush, across a small creek, and eventually into an open ravine. And that's when I saw it. It was the kind of buck hunters dream about: a massive, towering rack, at least 16 points, with a body like a tank. Its coat was pristine, dark brown, almost blending into the trees behind it. It was easily the biggest deer I'd ever laid eyes on. But there was a problem. The shot wasn't clear. Trees and brush made it impossible to line up. We decided to move in, careful, slow, and silent. But as luck would have it, my foot found a hidden branch, and the snap echoed like a gunshot. The buck bolted. Frustration hit like a punch to the gut, but we weren't giving up that easily. We followed its tracks deeper into the woods, each step taking us further from camp. The excitement kept us moving, but after a while I realized how deep we had gone. The sun was dipping lower, and the last thing we needed was us to be navigating these unfamiliar woods in the dark. We hesitated, debating on whether we should turn back. That's when we heard it. Something moved just out of sight. Not the quick, nervous steps of a deer, but something else, slow, deliberate. My friend whispered that it might be the buck, circling back. It was enough to convince us that we should take a look. The sound led us into a clearing, but instead of the deer, we found something else: a cabin. At first glance, it looked like a hunting lodge, small and well used. A rack stood outside, meant for hanging and cleaning kills. It seemed normal, until I looked closer. Lining the far side of the cabin were stakes driven to the ground, each one topped with a skull. At first, I thought they were all animals: deer, bears, wolves, but then my stomach turned. One of them was different. It was human. I barely had time to process it before I noticed something else. Backpacks, at least half a dozen, stacked against the cabin's wall. Beyond them, fresh graves, uneven mounds of dirt scattered haphazardly. My friend had moved to the window. I wanted to tell him to get away, but he motioned me over, his face pale. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and peered inside. The walls were lined with trophies, not just animal skulls, but human ones, mounted like hunting prizes. Bones were scattered across the floor, some cracked open like someone had taken a blade to them. A hunting knife sat on the table nearby, its edge still wet with something dark. A wave of nausea hit me, but before I could react, we heard it. Footsteps. Someone was coming. We ducked behind a tall stack of firewood as the footsteps got closer. A moment later, a man stepped into the clearing. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, broad, built like a bear. He carried a heavy bag slung over his shoulder, and my stomach sank when I realized it was roughly the size of a human body. The man disappeared inside the cabin, shutting the door behind him. My friend and I locked eyes. This was our chance. We moved as fast as we dared, skirting the edge of the clearing. We were almost to the tree line when the cabin door swung open. I turned, locking eyes with the man. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, he turned back inside. That was worse than if he had just charged us. We bolted, crashing through the trees. Then the gunshot started. Bullets tore through branches, splintering bark, whizzing past us. One hit a tree inches from my face. Another buried itself in the dirt near my foot. We ran until our lungs burned, until the gunshots faded into the silence, until we saw our truck. We didn't pack up, we didn't hesitate. We jumped in and tore down the dirt road, not stopping until we had cell service. The police met us and escorted us back to our camp. Some of our gear was still there, but our guns, food, and packs were gone. When they asked if we could take them to the cabin, I refused. Instead, I did my best to mark its location on a map. A few weeks later, I called to check in. The officer on the other end sighed before telling me the truth. They hadn't found it. No cabin, no bones, no graves, nothing. I don't know what was worse, the idea that they never found the place, or the thought that maybe, just maybe, the man had packed up and moved somewhere else, somewhere new. Hunting had always been a ritual for me and my best friend Tim. We had our routine down to perfection. Every season, we'd load up my truck, stop at the same gas station for snacks and drinks, and head to our favorite hunting spot, just a short drive from my house. We knew those woods like the back of our hands, each trail, each clearing, every perfect vantage point. That morning was no different. I picked up Tim, we grabbed our usual supplies, and before long, we were parked at the familiar dirt lot on the outskirts of the forest. The air was cool, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Everything felt just as it should. After unloading our gear, we made our way into the woods. Our tree stands had been up for years, positioned about a quarter mile apart. We never hunted in the same stand, but we kept in touch using walkie-talkies. It was something we had always done, a way to stay connected even in the silence of the woods. When we reached Tim's stand, I watched as he climbed up, got settled, and then gave me a thumbs up. Then I turned and headed towards my own spot. And that's when I noticed it. The air felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could put my finger on. But there was something off about the forest that morning. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to a weird mood. Maybe I was just imagining things. I reached my stand, climbed up, and settled in. Pulling my walkie from my belt, I checked in with Tim. He hadn't seen anything yet, just the usual stillness of the early morning woods. Then we waited. An hour passed, and something felt wrong. It just wasn't a gut feeling anymore. Something was missing. The forest was silent. Not a single bird, not a rustling squirrel, nothing. The woods were always alive with movement, but today it was as if every living thing had vanished. My walkie crackled. Tim's voice came through, hushed but tense. He said he saw something. I asked if it was a deer. He hesitated before answering. He wasn't sure. Whatever it was big. A long silence followed. Then came the scream. The walkie exploded with static in Tim's frantic, terrified voice. I couldn't make out the words, but his panic was unmistakable. I called back, demanding to know what was happening. No response. Adrenaline hit me like a punch to the chest. I jumped down from my stand, grabbing my walkie again. My voice was shaky as I called for him. The walkie clicked, then static, then a whisper. I see you. I froze, staring at the walkie in my hand. It sounded like Tim, but it wasn't quite right. The voice was too soft, too controlled. A chill ran down my spine. Was he messing with me? I told him it wasn't funny. I asked again if he was okay. Silence. Then the static crackled again. A strange, distorted laugh came through. My stomach twisted into knots. That definitely wasn't Tim. My grip on the walkie tightened as I turned and sprinted towards his tree stand. The whole way there, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a weight. Every shadow between the trees felt deeper, every sound non-existent. I reached his stand. It was empty. I shouted out for him. Nothing. Our emergency plan flashed in my mind. If we ever got separated, we'd meet at the truck. If something had happened, that's where he would go. I turned back towards the direction of the truck and started moving fast. My heart pounded with each step. Then the walkie clicked again. The whisper returned. Don't go. Come back. I stopped cold, looking over my shoulder towards the empty stand. Maybe Tim was playing a trick. Maybe he was hiding nearby. I almost turned back. Almost. But something deep inside me, something primal, screamed at me to run. I bolted. Branches snapped underfoot as I sprinted through the woods, my breath ragged, my mind racing. The feeling of eyes on me grew stronger with each passing second. By the time I reached the truck, I saw Tim pacing beside it. He looked pale, his hands trembling. As soon as he saw me, he ran up to me, barely holding back tears. He told me what happened. He had seen something moving in the trees. At first, he thought it was a deer. But then he saw the eyes. 2 glowing red eyes staring at him from the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, something hit the tree he was in, shaking it violently. Tim lost his grip. He fell, crashing hard into the dirt below. His walkie flew out of his hand. He didn't stop to grab it. He just ran. The moment he finished telling me, my blood turned to ice. If Tim hadn't been using the walkie, then who, or what, had been speaking to me? Without another word, we jumped in the truck and sped away, leaving the forest behind. Neither of us ever went back.